by way of anecdote, my son called me last night from Washington, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm moderating a panel with 2 federal prosecutors from one of the largest cities in the United States, and a prominent state prosecutor, and the deputy chief of police from one of our largest cities." And my son said, "Gee, how'd you get to do that?" And the second thing I said was I started telling them about the topic of the discussion and how they put cases together against these cartels, and how they use electronic surveillance and wiretapping. And he said to me, "Gee, they get to do that. How come you don't have a cool job like that, Dad?" So, you know, with that said, the title of the panel is Drug Enforcement Challenges in the U.S., but, you know, by way of comment, what I come to realize from listening to the sessions over the last several days is that it's not just a problem that is defined by geographic boundaries. And I think what you're going to hear the folks talk to you about today is that the cases that are being put together in Decatur or DeKalb County and the city of Atlanta, and the investigations the deputy chief are doing really have their genesis across the border in Mexico, across the geographic border, but the border that really doesn't exist as far as these cartels are concerned. So as you listen to these presentations, what I'd like you to think about is what it means to you and how we all can collectively work together. And also, I'd really like to make this a panel or a presentation where people are posing questions and challenging each other and asking questions. And so with that said, I'm really pleased that we're able to have 2 high-level federal prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Georgia, Bill Thomas, who's the chief of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force in the Narcotics Section, Scott Hulsey, who's the deputy chief, and from DeKalb County, we have Mike Scott Carlson, who's the assistant district attorney for the Office of DeKalb County District Attorney, and Calvin Moss, who's the deputy chief of the Atlanta Police Department. And anecdotally, I think our paths probably crossed 25 years ago when he was an officer and I was doing work for the labor union. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Scott and Bill, why don't you guys kick it off?
Thank you, Reuben. I guess in keeping with what you have how you laid out the parameters, I have a very few brief prepared remarks, and then I'll just open it up for questions, which I always think is what's most helpful in forums like this, so that we can talk a little bit about what I do, and certainly Scott and I can answer whatever questions that, to the extent that we can, that you may have about the type of work we do. As was said, I am the chief of the narcotics section here in Atlanta. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we do on a daily basis. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. All right. How's that? All right. As was said, I'm the chief of the narcotics section here in Atlanta, and I want to talk just a little bit this morning or this afternoon about what I do and what we do there. We have about 17 prosecutors, and our focus is really to focus on the drug trafficking issue as it relates to Atlanta, and actually really across the country, as I'll discuss in a minute. I think as goes drug trafficking in Atlanta, it also impacts the nation really, as Atlanta has become a hub. Our focus is primarily Mexican drug trafficking organizations, as that appears to be, or that is the significant threat here in Atlanta and throughout the country. Our focus is quite simply, to the extent that we can, cutting off the head of that organization. What we try to do is focus at the organization, the drug trafficking organization, the cartel, at its highest level, and work to dismantle those particular organizations. In recent years, as Atlanta has gained more, I guess the word is more significance, more prominence, the population has grown, it has become a business hub. It has also become more important and more significant for the drug trafficker. Just as businesses relocate to Atlanta to facilitate their growth and putting their legitimate product out there, we've seen the cartels do the same thing. Drugs start in Mexico, or at least they are transshipped to Mexico. I think the previous speaker talked to you about how the cocaine starts elsewhere, but is transshipped to Mexico. It crosses the southwest border, and then is transshipped in many instances in significant amounts to Atlanta, where some of it stays in Atlanta, and then some is then distributed up the eastern seaboard throughout the southeast. We see it going to South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas, and Alabama. I'm sorry, I said Texas, not Texas, but Alabama, and those cities, with Atlanta being the hub, the operational headquarters. I think the analogy to help understand how these things work, at least on this side of the border, is much like legitimate organizations will send workers, will establish headquarters in various places. Again, that's what the cartels do. Atlanta has become a place where they have come here, they establish headquarters, they establish organizations or groups to facilitate the organization's goals. We call those cells. There are multiple cells that are sent here to establish these organizations. The significant difference between again, what would be a legitimate organization and the drug trafficking organization is these cells, to the extent they can, want to operate with some degree of anonymity, so that the left hand, if you will, doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So the people who transport the drugs will not necessarily be the people who distribute the drugs. The people who distribute the drugs will not necessarily be the people who collect the money. And that's obviously done to, if law enforcement is successful in its efforts, one person can't tell on the other person. Our focus and what we do, again, is through the use of various means, is try to focus on those particular cells and try to dismantle those organizations. We've had some successes in doing that. We have, I think, affected geographically what these cartels do. What I mean by that is we have seen them move to other areas where the law enforcement presence is not as great. We have seen prices go up in the product that has been distributed. I believe when I started doing this, price of a kilo of cocaine was probably $16,000, $17,000. In 12 years, we've seen that price go to $28,500, $30,000. I think certainly some of that is attributable to the efforts and the things that we've done here in Atlanta, and also the things that have happened on the other side of the border in Mexico. So we have seen some successes, but I think that because of those successes, I think the organizations have seen what we do, and so they've adjusted. So I think that what the future of what we do, we're going to have to change our techniques and change what we do to some extent, and that's probably, I would say, where we are today as we speak, and that is looking at how now they've adjusted, and I think law enforcement will be adjusting too. That's probably a good stopping place for me. I'll open it up for, I don't know if you want the questions now or.
Let's go. I guess maybe let's go to your colleague. If anybody has any questions, any urgent questions, we're happy to open the floor to some brief ones after the next speaker.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Back in the summer of 2008, I was sitting at my desk just doing some busy work when I had some agents walk into my office and basically, I think we've got a problem here. We think we have a guy who maybe have been taken hostage. What do we do? When the agents came in, they were in the middle of investigating what we call a Title III wire case. And that, of course, is where agents seek authority from a judge to, in essence, conduct a wiretap on the telephones of suspected drug criminals or other criminals, for that matter. And that's sort of the bane of our investigative technique is the wiretaps. But the agents came in and said, look, I think we've got a problem. We're listening to these wires. We're hearing people talk. And we have reason to believe somebody is being held hostage. Moreover, not only do we think this person is being held hostage, but we actually think he's about to be killed. So we had to make a decision about what to do. Of course, there is the consideration of the investigation itself and not compromising a long-standing investigation. This cost, by that point, tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. But really, it was a no-brainer. We had to do the right thing, find out where this guy was, and ultimately have him extricated. So the agents, using various electronic surveillance and with great diligence, were able to sort out where this person was. We had approached the court to get the appropriate warrants to do this, and within a matter of several days, found the house, ultimately kicked down the door, went in. There were 3 captors at that time holding this person hostage. They all fled, but fortunately the agents were pretty quick and caught them all, albeit capturing one of them was a little bit like a scene out of Rambo. He escaped, went down the sewer system, crawled through like some waterways, and ultimately agents were out at night by this point with their flashlights, and all of a sudden they see a head emerge to gasp air, and that's how they caught the 3rd guy. But in any event, they caught 3 of the captors that were there, although it's believed there were actually, over the course of this week or so that this guy was being held, possibly 8 or more people holding him hostage. I actually had an opportunity to go out to the scene myself and look at it. It was kind of creepy. It was in a drug stash house, which basically those are houses that are completely bare of anything. They're used for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to move drugs or sometimes to move money. This was one of those houses. Of course, it was in the middle of a residential neighborhood in Gwinnett County. When I drove out there, there's kids playing on the street, people walking, enjoying their day, not knowing that in their midst is this drug trafficking house. So I go in, and you go down to the basement, which was half finished, and here was this guy sitting in a chair, emaciated, dehydrated. Apparently during the course of the week, based on what he told us, they'd given him 1 hamburger, maybe 1 glass of water, and so by the time the agents found him, he was actually hyperventilating, and again, he was close to being killed. It turns out he was a drug dealer himself. This was a cell that was based here in Atlanta. Mexico-based drug trafficking organization had a cell operating here in Atlanta. These cells distribute the drugs up and down the eastern seaboard. This guy happened to work in Rhode Island for this cell. But the folks working here had brought him down under a ruse. He owed a drug debt of, at least allegedly, about $300,000. So the drug dealers brought him down under some sort of a ruse. He came down voluntarily, met up at a Waffle House, and then was even sort of tricked into coming back to this house. And when we got to the house, 8 men beat him up, then brought him down to the basement where they chained him to a wall, where he'd been for the week before we found him. I bring up this story to say that I think this highlights some of the points that Bill made in talking before me. First of all, it sort of, I think, helps show the problem that we have here. We have these, like I said, Mexican-based drug trafficking organization cells that operate here in the Atlanta area. They set up, as Bill said, they have people who do different things, including these cells have persons who are the strong arm or the enforcers or whatever you want to call them, and that's what the people were who were caught in this case. They were people who were brought in specifically for the purpose of handling somebody who had screwed up. We didn't capture, at least on that day, the people who were responsible for distributing the drugs or collecting the money, but these were some of the enforcement arm of the cell. And then one thing, just sort of as a side note, when I went to court and first saw these guys, I was actually kind of shocked because they were so young. They didn't even look like they shaved, and I just couldn't believe that these guys were the enforcers for the organization, but lo and behold, that's what they were. This fact, I think this shows the violence that's associated with these cells. There were multiple firearms, including an assault weapon that was found in the house. Obviously, this guy had been treated, manhandled at gunpoint, and like I said, starved and dehydrated. This also, I think, helps to show the danger that's posed to the community by these cells. Again, this is a house in the middle of any neighborhood you might visit. It was a nice 2-story house. Again, kids playing on the street. It wasn't in the hood, the ghetto, whatever you might typically think of as being a place where you would find drug trafficking cells. It also, I think, helps show the compartmentalized nature of how these things operate. Again, not only did we only find the enforcement people, but when we talked to them, realized, hey, they don't really know who are the people that are dealing the drugs, who are the people laundering the money. So these organizations, as Bill said, compartmentalize themselves such that if they are caught, they really can't point the finger at somebody else. I also brought up this as a sort of to show you how our office operates, or how the agents that we work with operate. They do conduct primarily these days Title III wire investigations. And in this case, it was serendipitous that they were, because without doing that, they would have never known about this person being held hostage. But they were listening to the phones of some of the higher level drug dealers within the organization. They heard this chatter. They actually brought me the line sheets, which I read in English. I don't speak Spanish, but they brought them to me in English. And I never would have known that that was actually what was going on. But fortunately, these agents are experts at what they do. And they were able to discern from this very nebulous conversation that in fact somebody was being held hostage. I think this case demonstrates a few other things as well. Number one, it demonstrates that to be successful in these cases, and I should note the three captors that we did find each received stiff sentences. The two of them received a sentence of 24 years and the other received a sentence of 26 years, in large part because of the violent nature of what had happened here. But the success, at least in this case, and I think a lot of others, is because here, I think more so than in a lot of countries. In fact, I just got back from working overseas for a year, where I was working with a country that was just transitioning to the sort of the adversarial system of law. But then they have the history of prosecutors and law enforcement working together hand in hand. We have that here, fortunately, and you could not accomplish our mission without that, particularly in complex cases that involve wire investigations, surveillance that lasts for a year or more even at times. But fortunately, we do have that here, and it was us working together, because for this to become a prosecutable case, the agents I had to work together actually make sure we had the right paperwork together to do the necessary electronic surveillance in order to even be able to find these guys and ultimately capture them. We could have had some problems down the line with our prosecution had we not worked together, gotten the right papers to go into the house to actually find the guy. The last thing I think a point I simply want to make was we've heard, I guess, speakers who have talked about, I guess, the challenges we face, and we do face a lot of challenges. But I also would like to point out that there are, at the same time, successes that we do experience in law enforcement. We take off a lot of drugs, more than you might imagine, and in researching this, Bill and I looked. Since 2006, the Northern District of Georgia alone, we've recovered more than $66 million from drug cartels operating here, some multiple thousand kilos of cocaine, and arrested, I think, it was either in excess of 300 or 500 suspected cartel members during that time. So while there are plenty of challenges and there's a long road ahead, there are, I think, some successes to mention as well. And I think with that, I'll stop. And then I know we have two other speakers, so I don't know if we...
Reuben, do you mind that question now?
Absolutely.
Please, yes.
Absolutely.
I just wondered, we heard some challenges earlier in the conference about whether the seizure of the drugs affects the price, right? So I don't know if you have any evidence that, in fact, that 66 million that you were able to take off the streets since 2006, you know, affected the price of the drugs in the market and caused it to go up. So that was one thing I wondered about as you were talking. And then the other thing I wondered, I think it would be very helpful for me to know something about the length of time then and the costs that are involved in going from what seems like a pretty clear case of guilt, right, finding a guy that's popping his head up out of the sewer, to that 26-year conviction. Do you know, can you tell us something about what was the time frame that was involved, and in any sense of the resources that it takes to get the conviction?
Sure. Maybe it makes sense if I speak to the case more generally. Okay, I'll answer your question as to this specific case, and I'll turn it over to Bill, maybe to address more generally some of your larger questions you raised. But as to this particular case that I worked on, well, first of all, let me note that the ultimate conviction of these guys was not the conclusion of the case. It was part of an ongoing Title III wire case, which was actually wrapped up probably within even a half year of this. The case that had started, and let me also say this is probably one of the longer cases on which I have worked, but it was a wire case in which we were probably up on the wires close to, maybe not completely a year, but close to a year in time. The wires are expensive. I think they can cost somewhere in the tens of thousands of dollars to run a wire because there's a lot to it. Probably the primary cost is to have Spanish-speaking wire monitors who are able to listen and translate calls. It is sort of an expensive proposition. However,
Make clear, that's for one phone.
right, and that would be just for just one phone. Over a case like this, we're gonna, I think we got up to probably well over 30 telephones we had listened to by the conclusion of this case. That being said, the reason we do these cases is we do think there's bang for the buck. So, for example, in this particular case, obviously there's the three folks who took this guy hostage. Kind of sadly for the victim, he got prosecuted himself as well for sort of bringing about this mess by sort of bringing the activity down here that caused him to get taken hostage. But over time, I think calculated there was somewhere between 20 and 25 defendants who ultimately were arrested, actually as part of a broader nationwide effort in which I think it's fair to say, I think in that one operation, well over 300 people, all associated with the La Familia cartel, if you're familiar with that, based in Michoacan, were taken down nationwide. So we do it because we think there's bang for the buck, and the reason we think there's bang for the buck is the wires allow us ultimately, as we work up the chain, to identify the cell structure and ultimately who's at the top of the cell that's operating here, and even their connections back in Mexico. And even in those cases, sometimes we'll try to extradite the persons from Mexico who are the leaders of the cell operating here. So I guess that's the answer maybe your question about this case. I'll turn it over to Bill for some of your broader questions.
As I said earlier, I'm the chief of the section now, but prior to becoming the chief, I was the deputy chief and a line assistant. And we probably started doing really wires probably pretty intensively about 6 or 7 years ago. So for 7 years, I've been involved in the process, and now I get to read all of the wiretap affidavits that come through, and in those affidavits, we often talk about the price of drugs. So I would say, again, in that 7-year period of time where we've actively been doing wires, I think we've steadily seen an increase in the price of cocaine, and more importantly, I didn't mention this earlier, the quality of that cocaine that we are seizing, anecdotally, I'm told from the agents that we work with, is going down. So I think that's another measure of the success. The price is going up, and it's not as good a quality product. Now, is that all attributable to law enforcement efforts? I think I'd be overstating it if I said that was the case. It's certainly there's certainly other factors that are probably go into that mix, but certainly I think because of what we do in Atlanta, from a law enforcement perspective, we've made the cost of doing business go up, and I think that's a good thing.
I want to get to Mike, but there was something intriguing. I had the pleasure, the honor of actually looking at their notes, and one of the things they wrote about was the hoops or the hurdles they have to jump over in order to, you mentioned the affidavit, actually get the legal right in the United States to wiretap. And maybe just briefly, if you can talk about, when you say that affidavit, the length of the affidavit, the effort, and then also the other thing that was intriguing is during the time it takes to get the warrant to do that, what happens when the suspect changes his cell phone number?
We as we've talked about today, the primary tool of law enforcement today, or federal law enforcement, is the wiretap. And to intercept a single telephone for a 30-day period generally requires an affidavit that is anywhere from 75 to 100 pages in length. And that's for each phone for each 30-day period of time. What has happened is, quite frankly, a few years ago, I would have been a little reluctant to talk about what we do and how we do it, but actually now the drug traffickers know what we do. They know that we're listening to their phones. And as a result of that, what happens is that they will buy these phones. They'll go into Walmart or Target or wherever they sell these prepaid telephones. They will buy these phones, and they will use them for very short periods of time. It is somewhat rare to see a drug trafficker using a phone for more than, really, if we can get 30 to 45 days on the phone, that's good. And then the process starts all over again, identifying a new number, a new affidavit. The affidavit, again, is 75 to 100 pages. I review it. A line assistant like Scott or somebody else will initially review it. I will review it. It goes to Washington for it to be reviewed. It's signed off by a deputy attorney general. It comes back and then has to go to a judge to be signed. We've gotten pretty good at it. We can probably do one now on a good day, probably 5 or 6 days. But it's somewhat of an arduous process that we go through to get these intercepts. And you add to that these traffickers know what we go through, and so they are constantly dropping their phones or using multiple phones at the same time.
That's true. Mike, you're going to talk about gangs, and we can come back to this, but please keep the dialogue going, because I think everybody should get involved in the discussion.
All right, again, my name is Mike Carlson, and I am the Deputy Chief for the Dekalb County District Attorney's Office Gang Prosecution Unit. And you are in Dekalb County right now, and it's a very diverse county, and of roughly 1 million people. So I wanted you to have that for your perspective. And I took this job after spending a period of time in private practice and prosecution ahead of time to head up what became Georgia's first ever dedicated gang prosecution unit at the time. And that occurred after, in 2006, there was a somewhat monumental change in Georgia law when our General Assembly enacted a specific law tailored to dealing with criminal street gangs. And I want to talk briefly now for a moment or two, and of course, we've got Chief here to speak and the rest of us to answer questions. But take a look at the criminal justice system as a whole and how exactly gang prosecution laws can improve public safety, including dealing with the drug situation. And that is not only a drug situation here, of course, it's in Mexico. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about one thing. Part of what I want to do here is show you what in Georgia and to some extent in the United States we're doing right, and some things we're doing wrong. Not in hopes of telling you necessarily what should be done in Mexico, because that's where you're the experts, but perhaps giving you the benefit of some of our perspective and some statistics and some experience that would be helpful to you, not only in working in your country, but working across the border with us. Now, before I do that, I want to give a little parable here, and I'll try to do it as I told our translators. My wife is Greek American. I work through family members sometimes to deal with the in-laws from the old country. If I go a little too fast, tell me and I'll slow down. But this is about a chicken farmer. And it's a chicken farmer who makes a living off the chickens and the eggs. But every night, when the farmer checks his chicken coops, a fox has been at work in there. And the fox is devouring the chickens and eating all the eggs. Well, after night after night after night after night of this happening, the farmer realizes he's not going to be in business very long if the foxes continue to have their way. So he decides he's going to do something about it. He heads out to the barn one morning, gets his best double-bladed axe, sharpens it up real well, gets it in both hands, and with all of his might swings that axe and kills his cat. Now, the farmer's taken decisive action. He's eliminated a four-legged mammalian predator that weighs under 20 pounds from his premises. But tomorrow morning, when he goes out to check the chicken coops, more poultry's been slaughtered, more eggs are gone, and now that he's killed the cat, he's got mice too. So we see that by only taking decisive action alone, we can waste resources, we can fail to deal with our actual problems, we can worsen our predicaments, and make things far worse. So in order to be decisive and important, we have to be effective. That means we've got to deal with the actual problems for what they are through the means that are completely, utterly, and proven effective in dealing with them. That's regardless of comfort, convenience, or preference. What works is going to be what works. We don't want to kill cats. So when we're talking about dealing with public safety in this country, and really in this hemisphere, we've got to consider the size, breadth, and dangers of criminal street gangs, because otherwise we're merely killing cats. Now, we've got to understand that. We've got to think about their scope and magnitude. And let me give you some 2009 federal statistics, our hard numbers. 2009 conservative comprehensive estimate from the FBI. The FBI calls this a low ball or a conservative, a low number. 1 million criminal street gang members, not associates, members, actively operating in the United States. That's a 200,000 increase from just 2005, and in terms of violent crime, they're committing 80% of it in this country. Now, if there were an army from a foreign nation of 1 million people in America, that army would constrain itself and operate under the Geneva Convention. It would only target other soldiers. Gangs target innocent, non-combatant citizens, as you'll see in a second. That's 1 million is double the size of many of our states, or more, in population. Now, according to studies, half of the victims of gang violence are innocent bystanders, disconnected with either gang in this country, not intended targets of either side. In this part of the country where you are now, the number is roughly 200,000. And again, these are materials that you have. Now, there's always a controversy, and I'm sensitive to it, and I know folks have spoken to you about what I'll just say, border issues. I'm only saying that because that's the way it comes up. But one thing that needs to be considered, and strongly here, is that some of the most virulent and violent criminal street gangs that operate in America started in America and actually got exported to Mexico and to Central America. That includes Sur 13, which sports, according to this report, at least 50,000 members. Norteños 14, I believe roughly 30,000 members. 18th Street, 50,000 members. The machete-wielding MS-13, which started in Los Angeles, as these other gangs did, roughly 50,000 members, 30 to 50,000 members. So it is not necessarily an issue, as unfortunately it gets characterized in this country as merely a border issue. These gangs were exported. But now what we see happening more and more is, and I can personally attest to this, Sureños, Norteños, 18th Street, Mara Salvatrucha members that I am prosecuting have never been to Los Angeles. They were indoctrinated into those gangs and became members before they ever came to America. So we have exported it, it has grown there, and now coming here, and vice versa, and continues, and of course, goes across the borders of our states completely. So it's an issue that needs to be addressed through other means that unfortunately sometimes are brought forward. This is the same situation in Georgia, okay, where the Chicago and Los Angeles gangs set up colonies here and the gangs grow, which is how we get to 200,000 in the Southeast. Now, of course there's a connection with drugs. Gangs have violent encounters over drug turf and territory. Remember, half of those shootouts, the bullet is going to strike an innocent bystander, somebody's grandmother coming back from the grocery store, a 4-year-old playing hopscotch. The first gang case I ever tried was in 1997, where I prosecuted 3 men for a drive-by shooting where the intended victim was missed. The gunfire from the Chinese knockoff of a Soviet assault rifle went into a residence where an 83-year-old grandmother was killed in her bedroom after playing with the grandkids that night. Now, the top street-level distributors in America of narcotics are gang members. So, if we aggressively pursue criminal street gangs, we deal with not only the drug crisis in this country, we also deal with a violent crime crisis because the gangs commit 80% of the violent crime. So if we isolate our efforts and only consider it on drugs rather than the ones dispensing the drugs, we are shortchanging what we're doing in terms of public safety. Now, while in America, use of drugs in according to many studies has gone down, due in no small credit to the gentleman sitting to my left, generally and specifically, gang distribution of drugs of every kind has continued to increase. So while these tremendous efforts are going on and being very effective, the gangs continue to accelerate, not only in size, but what they do. Now, gang violence, of course, spreads, and in America, it heads into rural and suburban areas more and more because those police departments and district attorneys' offices are much lower staffed and often not prepared to deal with it in the same way. This is a concerning statistic, and we talked about that spread in that earlier slide. This region of the country has Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, Fresno, and Las Vegas. This is the only section of America that has more law enforcement agencies reporting gang incidents than the Southeast. The Southeast has a higher gang rate, according to law enforcement, than even the region of the country that has Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Louis, etc. Detroit. Now, is it just a metro issue? Now, there's a map of the state of Georgia. There's a class at our Public Safety Training Center where people who are interested in learning about how to investigate gangs come and take the course. So these are only the communities that take that course. These are the counties that reported multiple gangs that came and took that course. And as you'll see, it's county after county. And within those 55 counties that made those reports, it's 1,100 criminal street gangs operating. Again, who are the number one in America distributors of drugs on the street? Criminal street gangs. There's not a county in Georgia that's not touched by this. And again, this is an important statistic because there are 156 counties in this state. So it's every possible geographic and political subdivision affected. Our legislature said in our General Assembly we're in a state of crisis. In fact, they made it a matter of statutory law, which is there, saying that it's a clear and present danger to the citizens. And they said we had to have a goal when we created a new law to deal with it, and that was to eradicate criminal street gangs. So now we have the question of, do we need a specialized set of law to deal with this crisis here in America, and perhaps in Mexico as well? Well, we know we do. The racketeering laws in this country are the test case, the scientific example of that. Well, how is that? Well, prior to the year 1970, there was not a single successful mafia or Cosa Nostra prosecution in America. Not one. What some commentators said, it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. And why is that? That's because the rules of evidence in existence at the time prevented investigators and prosecutors from being able to present to juries the full scope of the mafia's activities. Once the RICO laws were passed and the rules of evidence were adjusted in accordance with it, within 25 years, the mafia was essentially a memory in America. So we had one statutory change that primarily allowed one thing, and that was an alteration in the rules of evidence. And we see what the effect can be. Now, what's the difference between gangs and the mafia? At its height, the mafia had only 3,000 to 5,000 members. Compare that to 1 million and ask whether or not America is in a state of crisis or not. So we obviously need gang statutes. We can't deal with gangs in a different way. But what's the difference between gangs and the mafia? Gangs operate on force, imposition of will, and excessive violence. They implant fear into communities, and unlike the mafia that wanted to be secret, remember, Cosa Nostra in Italian means our thing. They did not want to be identified. They did not wear colors. They did not have tattoos. They did not walk 8 abreast down the street. They did not spray paint neighborhoods to make let law-abiding citizens, police officers, and other gangs know this is our neighborhood and nobody else's. Mafia didn't do that, but gangs do. So obviously, statutes that work strictly for the mafia, RICO, are not going to transition effectively over for gangs. So we need a conduit to get in the evidence of gang activities into cases. Now, unfortunately, federally, we don't have a Gang Prosecution Act in this country for adults. So, because of that, many states, even states with RICO laws already, or in fact, especially those with RICO laws, have formed them. Georgia has one. It gives us definition, charging provisions, procedural rules to let gang evidence in, and provides us with sentencing penalties. Basically, attorneys, and judges, professors, here's how this works. If there's a connection in any crime between the gang, the defendant, and the offense, we can bring the additional charge of a Gang Act violation. When we do that, then we can bring in all of the criminal activity that the gang has ever committed anywhere, from Los Angeles to San Salvador to Alexandria, Virginia to Atlanta, in every trial. So now the jury, or in your cases the judge, gets to legally consider exactly what this entity is, so that this defendant's conduct in the beating and the shooting and the drug deal is not dealt with in isolation. What are the goals? The goals in any gang case or investigation should be to stop the gang, to eradicate the gang. In other words, not just to go after this particular defendant. In other words, we need to slay the hydra and not feed it. Otherwise, we're just killing cats again. Are gang acts effective? Well, you've got a test case here in Dekalb County. Let's take a look. In Dekalb County, our unit has over 60 convictions and 60 defendants, in excess of 1,000 years of sentence since the unit was formed. Some of those have been people who have provided us information. They've received probation. Some of them have received prison sentences in decades. Now, what's that meant in terms of crime? 30% decrease in armed robbery, 46% decrease in homicides. We had one of our gangs, which was an area gang. Some accounts had them committing 10 shootings, 10 drive-by shootings in only 10 days. They gave us more case files than anyone, including SIR 13 or MS 13. We haven't had a criminal case file in from them in over 18 months. So what we say, the community, that's a lot of hardship, a lot of agony, a lot of pain that people aren't experiencing now, and probably people that are alive now that otherwise wouldn't have been. And it came from a law change. So again, I wanted to go through these issues quickly with you and talk about where we've done well and perhaps where we could use some improvement. And I know we'll be here for questions, but I wanted to thank you for what we're doing here together to help both of our countries keep our innocent citizens safe. For the very reason, a lot of reasons. One in particular is because of what our gang statute here allows us to do, and many other states does as well, as a matter of evidence, we are able to present at trial of any one gang member or associate the activities of the gang worldwide. That is so the jury is fully educated about what exactly this organization is and what it means for this defendant to be associated with it in connection with this particular crime. That includes, of course, information coming out of any country. So information in terms of activities of gangs coming from Mexico is as valuable to us in that process as information from Chicago or Los Angeles, because it's all part of the process of being able to introduce to the jury the information that gives the proper context for the offense in question.
I want to get to the chief, but just a quick thought. As we're collecting evidence in Mexico, I mean, one of the things that I suspect we should think about maybe for questions is what are the implications in Mexico of our domestic laws of evidence? In other words, are we now in a situation where folks who are doing the gathering in Mexico have to understand our laws of evidence? And clearly what I'm getting from you at least is there's a value in understanding our domestic gang laws, because we may be collecting evidence to meet the elements of proof.
Absolutely. I would agree with that completely. And one thing we want to consider in any judicial system, the rules of evidence are truly the conduit for justice. Because whether you have a jury trial system or a case where the judge makes the decision, the rules of evidence in any society will determine alone what information can be considered and how that information will be considered. So knowledge on the part of law enforcement investigators here and law enforcement and prosecutors in Mexico of the way we present our evidence will, of course, assist us in our efforts here.
Okay. Chief.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to be here with you and my learned colleagues. I've been asked this afternoon to speak to these some of the specific challenges that we in law enforcement face here in Atlanta with regard to drug enforcement. In a nutshell, the challenges are complex and many, but I would ask you to please bear in mind that that is the approach that I'm taking to this, is to discuss some of the drug enforcement challenges that we experience in one of America's largest cities. The illegal drug trade, as you probably know, is probably the most challenging and dangerous areas of law enforcement that we experience here in the States. It serves multiple and sometimes competing interests and goals, ultimately trying to reduce drug abuse, controlling predatory crime that stems from narcotics trafficking, purchasing and selling, preventing the growth of large-scale criminal enterprises, and protecting neighborhoods from the ill effects of drug activity in the neighborhood. Those who distribute drugs are often violent. Those who consume drugs typically will resort to almost any act in order to get their next supply. The challenges are many: budgetary constraints, technology issues, as well as the need for effective coordination and communication amongst federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies, our learned colleagues here at the table, the district attorneys throughout the state, as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office, and others. Nationwide, I think it's fair to say that agencies large and small, public and private, are facing significant budgetary constraints. And of course, the Atlanta Police Department is certainly no different. Personnel expenses, the vehicle fleet, our rolling stock, and the equipment that's dedicated to simply responding to the 1.2 million 911 calls or calls for police service that we get on an annual basis takes the about 97 to 98% of the total budget set aside for the Atlanta Police Department. So maintaining a focus, if you will, on drug enforcement in addition to calls for service is certainly a challenge, and it underscores the need for us to continue to work collectively to identify alternative funding sources so that we can indeed focus more on drug enforcement and violence reduction. It's interesting to me in my 29 years with the police department that just as law enforcement professionals change our approach to investigative tactics or strategies that we use, so too do drug traffickers and, yes, indeed, gang members and the like. Consequently, we have to try and keep up with the street trends of drug traffickers, and that in and of itself is a strategic and tactical challenge. Drug traffickers more and more these days will employ surveillance techniques while conducting their details and their deals. Cell phones, text paging, the internet have all made it very easy for them to shift their business model, and I would encourage you to think of it as a business, and also to shift their locations, how they conduct business, and further challenge law enforcement. So we have to increasingly resort to more covert means through our enforcement efforts, as well as reaching beyond just simply the police radio to communicate with one another and carry out our tactical details. So another challenge we find is maintaining continual training standards and identifying new techniques for sophisticated intelligence gathering and sharing information amongst our federal, state, and local partners. In the United States, there are more than 17,000 law enforcement agencies, nearly 700 in the state of Georgia alone. As a result, as you can imagine, communication, coordination, and cooperation is not only critical, but somewhat challenging, to say the least. It's an ever-present challenge, but it is one of the mission-critical issues that we have got to collectively work together to solve. Every day, drug trafficking organizations move large quantities of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, and other illicit drugs into the United States, distributing them throughout the nation, and particularly throughout North America. Many of these organizations are based in Colombia or Mexico. They operate throughout North America and in many other countries. And these same groups, at times working through street and prison gangs, employ criminal networks that return the illicit proceeds of the drug trade along with an array of weapons across our borders. This two-way trade imposes yet further negative consequences on the safety, health, and security of our citizens. Drug trafficking, the violence related with it, the associated crime that comes along with it, constitute a significant national security threat, in my estimation, and continues to be very taxing on the resources and capabilities of the United States. So it is critical that the United States, law enforcement agencies, and all of our partner agencies here in the States partner with our partner nations in order to attempt to solve some of that and ultimately disrupt the drug trafficking organizations that impact all of our lives. As I alluded to earlier, make no mistake, drug trafficking is clearly a business, and I would encourage all of us to consider it just as such. Federal, state, local law enforcement agencies have got to consistently seek not to only seize drugs, money, and guns, but ultimately, the end game is to identify and disrupt drug trafficking organizations and money laundering organizations that work hand in hand. And they need to be attacked at their root. Of course, seizures of guns, drugs, money associated with drug trafficking needs to continue, clearly, but increasingly law enforcement needs to look at that, in my estimation, as not the end result or the finished goal, but rather simply the beginning of the investigation. Now, it is true that oftentimes an investigation will begin with a simple seizure by a state or local police officer of an amount of illegal drugs or a weapon or some cash. But it is critical that we apply a return on investment approach using this business model when we start trying to prioritize the strategies that we think we need to employ. Routine, and more importantly, perhaps, effective coordination of the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies will ultimately, I believe, benefit our collective drug enforcement efforts. It's critical that information be shared quickly, reliably, and accurately amongst these 17,000 law enforcement agencies just here in the States in order to disrupt the trafficking networks, many of which operate in virtually any city, state, town, suburban area, just about anywhere in the United States. The other piece of the puzzle from my perspective is that I think we need to continue and indeed increase our focus on asset forfeiture and seizure laws and essentially try and hit the drug trafficking organizations where it troubles them the most, and that is in the pocketbook. I live in a small town just outside the city of Atlanta, and there are a couple of vehicles that the local sheriff's department has seized as a result of drug investigations. It's a complicated area of law, and particularly when it comes down to seizing real assets such as a house or a business or something of that sort. Oftentimes, governments can be less than forceful in trying to go that route because many times it's not seen as a friendly approach, if you will. But I can't tell you how important that message is when I see that patrol car or two traveling around in the area where I live, and stamped on the side of it, it says, courtesy of your local drug dealer. It sends a very important and powerful message, in my estimation. For some of you, I suspect this is your first time in Atlanta. I certainly want to welcome you here. It's an honor to have you in our city. But I've been with the department for 29 years, and I've seen a good many changes here in not only the city, but the metro area and our state entirely. There are just over 9 million residents in the state of Georgia. More than half of those live in the metropolitan Atlanta area. In addition, there's some 24 law enforcement agencies that have jurisdiction just inside the city of Atlanta. Again, back to point one, that of communication, cooperation, and coordination. It's important from my perspective to understand that the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta is both a final destination point for some drug shipments, and it's also a major smuggling corridor for drugs. The city lies at the crossroads of several major interstate highways. We also boast the world's busiest airport pretty routinely between us and Chicago's O'Hare. And it truly does serve as the gateway to the Southeast. This extensive network of railway lines, bus lines, interstate systems, as well as the international, regional, and private airports make Atlanta clearly a very appealing target, ultimately running drugs, whether they're coming here or simply passing through on the way to the eastern seaboard. We see that pretty routinely. In the police department, much like I think many local law enforcement agencies, we take a four-tiered approach to narcotic enforcement, and we try to match the resources we throw at something with the level of drug distribution and trouble that they cause in our neighborhoods. So our first line of defense is the typical beat officer. That's the officer who, if you dialed 911 right now, would answer the call, would simply show up here and say, how can I help you, and try to deal with the problem. So that is kind of the lowest level. Thereafter, we have what we call the Red Dog street level drug unit. If you travel about Atlanta, you might see them. They typically travel in teams of 3 or 4. They wear the dark militaristic BDU-looking uniforms. And their almost exclusive focus is on street corner drug dealing, which is typically what we get the most complaints about from our residents. Above that, we have our narcotics unit, which is designed to focus on mid-level drug traffickers. And finally, we reach those areas that oftentimes we see our friends at the district attorney's office and the U.S. attorney's office ultimately on, and that is through our joint operations with other federal agencies and task forces. One of the most significant in terms of drug trafficking here in Atlanta is what we refer to as HIDA, High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. In 1995, Atlanta was designated by the Office of National Drug Control Policy as a HIDA city or a HIDA area. Presently, the HIDA footprint contains some 18 counties here in the state, the city of Atlanta, of course, and several counties now in North Carolina. Again, speaking to Atlanta being kind of a pass-through route to the eastern seaboard for many of the narcotics here. I began this with the problems are many and complex, but I think it's important to emphasize, as my friends here have, that progress is indeed being made. I think that our best bet is collective partnerships, not unlike what I see here today. I'm very encouraged to see this, and thank you very much for taking your time to be here. Last year, the Atlanta Police Department made some 5,300 arrests for narcotic-related activities, seized more than 2,300 guns, and ultimately, in conjunction with our other partners at federal, state, and local level, seized over $100 million worth of illegal drugs from a street level or street value perspective. The last thing I would touch on is the dangers associated with narcotics trafficking, particularly to police officers on the street, as has been alluded to by some of my colleagues here. We have seen a marked increase in the number of firearm seizures, typically associated with narcotics trafficking, somewhere in the area of 12 to 15% over the last year. And that turns into a pretty significant number. Unfortunately, we lost one of our Red Dog officers a few years ago who was killed in the line of duty by someone who, in fact, he was trying to investigate for drug trafficking. Ultimately, I do hope that I've brought some concerns from the city of Atlanta's perspective as far as drug enforcement problems, if you will, or challenges. I look forward to the questions, and I hope that this has been helpful.
Chief, you've provoked me to think of a number of questions, but
Sure.
The one that comes to mind immediately is a question that arose actually yesterday with the talk that the Attorney General of New Mexico gave. and he was talking about his counterparts in Italy, and they had seized, I guess, an olive oil company that had been run by the Cosa Nostra, and they were selling it as mafia olive oil. And he said there's a value of returning these assets and the forfeitures to the community because the community sees what's going on. And it struck me when you talked about the police car. And I guess what I'd want to ask you is that something that's prevalent, and is that something that can be replicated? I mean, what's the value in the community of that kind of effort?
I believe the value in the community is significant. Now, it's critical that if asset forfeiture laws are successfully used and property seized, that in order to get the bang for the buck, if you will, in going that route, you have to share that information with the community so that they know this piece of property, this vehicle, this house, business, whatever the case is, was seized at no expense other than typical business expense to the jurisdiction, but it's ultimately benefiting the community and was taken off the street or out of circulation by from the bad guys, if you will. So yes, I think the message is significant, and we'd love to find a major corporation here that we could pull that off with.
The other question is you know, I have 3 prosecutors, and then your task in part is to keep law and order and to collect evidence. And what strikes me is that I sort of perceive a situation in the days ahead where the authorities in the United States are going to be working with their counterparts in Mexico to collect evidence. And maybe from the folks with the U.S. Attorney's Office and Mike, and you, Chief, the question of when you're collecting evidence, do you perceive a problem if evidence is being collected in Mexico? What constitutional requirements are going to have to be met if the evidence is used in a U.S. court? And then, Chief, from your perspective, maybe what do you do when you work with the prosecutors to make sure that you're complying with those requirements? So I guess maybe I'll start with my prosecutorial colleagues here on that question.
I guess I'll tackle that. I think that every scenario, or let me say it this way, that there will probably be varying scenarios of how we would want to use evidence that was obtained in a foreign country. Now, some of it may have an intelligence value. It may just be of a value that it's a pointer, if you will, to operations in the United States. There, the constitutional concerns and how that evidence was seized, it will be a different analysis. Obviously, if we want to use the evidence in court, I think the court is going to view how that evidence was taken. Obviously, different systems obviously have different rules, particularly with emerging systems. There are going to be challenges in how that evidence is going to be used. And I think that the best answer today is it's probably going to be a case-by-case analysis of what occurred in a particular situation and how that evidence is going to be used on this side of the border.
And Mike and Scott, I want to follow up with you. And the reason I asked that question is we've been doing advocacy training in Mexico, and the sense I got, maybe from my limited perspective, was we were thinking about prosecution in Mexican courts. But through the last 2 days, what I'm really thinking is, you know what, our Mexican counterparts are going to be in the process of collecting evidence potentially for use in U.S. courts. So does it make sense for us to include in our curriculum efforts to explain to folks what the evidentiary requirements are here so we can do a better job of collecting evidence? And I don't know whether Scott and Mike, you have a perspective on that. I mean, for example, if the applications of the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment, when you're seizing evidence, and use of evidence that's collected in Mexico in a U.S. court. I mean, do you perceive an issue? Is it something that we should discuss? Should somebody be writing a law journal on it or article on it?
I guess speaking from my perspective, working at the U.S. Attorney's Office, first of all, let me say that's not something we would encounter as much as you might anticipate. Generally, the cases we build, even if the source of supply ultimately is in Mexico, we're generally focused on the activities of that person and that organization here in the U.S. So it's not something we encounter a lot. As Bill said, and this was true when I worked overseas as well, where you see that maybe more commonly is in the area of intelligence, which can be shared and then independent evidence developed of that. That being said, I mean, I still think it would certainly be beneficial to the extent we can find ways to collaborate better together, even to the point where maybe instead of taking a defendant here, that same defendant with maybe even some of the evidence here, but largely on what he's done there, could be prosecuted, for example, in Mexico. So I think anything that would improve collaborative efforts between the two countries would be beneficial. I think there's a lot of steps before we get to that point. I think you have to have treaties in places. In fact, when I was working in Bosnia, they were actually dealing with this a lot in connection with Serbia and war crimes. And evidence sharing was a big issue, and it requires treaties and a host of other stuff to be in place before you can even enact those treaties. So I don't know that we're at a point where you see a lot of evidence sharing, but to the extent we could ever get to that point, have a more collaborative effort, since this is indeed a problem, this completely intertwined what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in the U.S., I think it can only be of benefit. And the only other thing, or the other thought that comes to mind, is simply the protections that we do have in place under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment generally will make any case better, even if it's not a requirement. For example, Fifth Amendment helps to ensure voluntariness of a statement, which is something that should matter in Mexico, even if there's not a constitutional requirement as such. But it would always matter, I think, it goes to the weight of what the court would be considering, deciding, well, do I believe this statement? Do I not believe this statement? Well, let me look at the voluntariness of how this, the voluntariness of the statement itself. And so I think the protections we have here are sort of based on some, I think, universally understood and accepted concepts, such that, evidence shouldn't be coerced out of somebody, but, if the statement should be coerced, but instead should be voluntary. And those principles are going to apply, I think, anywhere and be helpful in the resolution of a case anywhere, even if we're not sharing the evidence with each other.
It's interesting. So what you're saying, I mean, from our Mexican colleagues, is that the due process requirements actually, to some degree, work to the benefit of the prosecutor because they make the evidence more credible.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And Mike, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, I think we want to take a look, too, when you're considering some of these evidence issues, and I really liked Bill's continuum there between, intelligence gathering type evidence, which especially applies very often to organizations, and also what Scott said about, universality of credibility in terms of the evidence that you're presenting, because, it really, certainly in America and anywhere else, trials, a significant component of the trial goes beyond the facts of the case and the law that's going to apply. It has to do with the credibility and the trust that the people bringing the charges, and even in a civil case, the ones bringing the lawsuit, have behind what they're doing. And of course, the more reasonable and protections that there are there for someone who is the target of an accusation, certainly the more credible the accuser will be. And I think the other area we need to think about, though, is sort of that dichotomy, really, between the intelligence and the evidence that you have on an organization and the extent to which that can be admissible when you're prosecuting the individual. And the rules would differ, of course, because of the accumulated activities of MS-13. In Georgia, for instance, can be brought in, as I mentioned before, in evidence against an individual member. You're dealing with a situation then where it is generalized, and an investigator from Mexico or El Salvador or any number of countries could be brought in to discuss those activities if the case warranted it. And of course, that's different than the type of evidence that was obtained from a single person and the protections that need to be in place there, which of course is a different threshold and higher. I would point out one other thing, and in terms of educating folks, that minor changes and alterations in the rules of evidence, for instance, can lead to radically different results in case after case after case. Federally, pre the delivery of Miranda warnings, a defendant's silence against an accusation can be introduced against him under the federal rules of evidence. That's called the adoptive admission rule. In Georgia, there is no such rule. So in Georgia, if a criminal defendant is standing with the bloody axe over the body of the victim, and the neighbors run out and say, "You just killed your wife, didn't you?" and he stands there and says nothing, that's not admissible against the criminal defendant in Georgia. Okay, radically different situation in federally, if perhaps the man's defense is going to be alibi or self-defense or anything like that, where he can be cross-examined. Well, if you're acting in self-defense, why didn't you say so at the time when your neighbor came over and asked you? So just the alteration of one minor rule can make a considerable difference in case after case after case after case. So when you're looking at the models of what sort of rule, again, we talked about rules of evidence being a key to dispensing justice. Every one that might seem minute at any moment, as they play out in court, can be the difference between justice getting delivered and justice being denied.
I have just one more question before I open it up, but you mentioned Miranda, and Chief, it's your folks who are responsible for reading people their Miranda rights. And what I want to know from you is, your people who work under your command are responsible in part for doing the investigation and putting together the evidence that these prosecutors are going to bring to trial. And at a ground level in the trenches, you're responsible for ensuring their constitutional rights. So what kinds of instructions do you give your investigators? What are they trained on? What do they understand so they can collect evidence in a way that's going to be admissible in court?
Well, in short, the Atlanta Police Department, as many police departments, DeKalb County, I believe, far exceed the state minimum requirements in terms of training that is required and provided to new police officers. So we have an ongoing in-service training curriculum that every officer every year must undergo. Of course, the curriculum is revised yearly, but it includes updates on issues affecting constitutional law and their applications, including Miranda, right to counsel, and the like. In short, we get concerned with Miranda at the point where an individual is going to be interrogated in a custodial situation. So in explaining all of the ramifications of Miranda, the right to counsel, right to silence, and so forth, we try to emphasize that there are a number of police-citizen encounters that do not implicate Miranda, and that we attempt to make the best use of those as we possibly can. So what that on occasion will mean is that an investigation may take a little bit longer than it perhaps could have, but ultimately there may be more physical evidence ultimately to show that the individual that is ultimately charged is responsible for the act, and perhaps we have to then rely less on any post-Miranda statements that are made. But in short, that's one of the great things I think about our justice system here, is that we walk that fine balance of ensuring that everyone's rights are respected, no matter what heinous act they may have been accused of.
And I gather from the rest of you people that makes your case more credible, makes it easier in some respects to prosecute the case.
I think absolutely that if we can all universally agree on one thing, that when we've respected everybody's rights and done it the right way, we're going to have a better day in court. If I could, let me just make one other point to your original question about evidence collection, particularly with respect to what Scott and I do. For the most part, our cases, when we deal with at the highest level of the cartels, and as we go forward with the Mexican authorities and doing these joint investigations and joint operations, there are going to be very few instances where we are working in a reactive sense. All of our investigations are generally proactive, and the point that I think that should be the takeaway as you guys teach Mexican prosecutors about going forward is that whether they're working with a U.S. prosecutor in anticipation of evidence that may come to the U.S., is that by far we have found that our best cases are made where we are working in a collaborative effort. And so what that means, I think, is if you know, or if we know that the Mexican authorities are going to raid a location in Mexico, we should be talking about that beforehand. And so where there may be some issues with how things would be seized and collected in Mexico versus how it would happen in the U.S. system, we need to be having that conversation to say, look, this is what we need to happen, this is what we need to take place, or otherwise we may have some issues with using that particular evidence. If a high-level target is going to be arrested in Mexico, we often know that in advance, or we often know that we're looking for that particular person. And we should be having that conversation in advance that, okay, if he is arrested, this is what we need to happen for this evidence to work in the United States. And I think generally where we have those types of conversations, we generally wind up with a good result.
Well, you actually prompted me to ask.
Reuben, I'm sorry to
sorry.
cut you off. We just have a few people who
I
have
profusely-
questions
yes,
out in
of
the
course.
audience, and I know we're running out of time, so I want to make
Yes.
sure we get to them. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much to the panelists for your most valuable presentations. I have one question directed perhaps to Mr. Carlson in regards with the application of the Georgia Gang Act. To what extent, if at all, does the application of such act diminishes the procedural or substantive rights of the defendant beyond the possibility of bringing evidence from abroad?
Not at all. And the reason for that is the Gang Act requires more of investigators and prosecutors to prove. In other words, in an average criminal case, you have to prove that the crime occurred beyond a reasonable doubt and that the defendant committed the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And in Georgia, you have to disprove any affirmative, it's not really an affirmative, you have to disprove any defense beyond a reasonable doubt. In some jurisdictions, for instance, if the defense is self-defense, that's something the defendant has to prove, perhaps by a preponderance of the evidence. In Georgia, we have to disprove, we have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt, including disprove something like self-defense. But you see, in a gang case, we have to prove the existence of the criminal street gang and a connection between the gang and the defendant and a connection between the gang and the crime. So because we have more to prove and specific elements to prove that you don't have in another criminal case, we're then allowed to bring in the other evidence. But if we can't get through that threshold, that initial level of proving, A, there's a gang in existence, B, this defendant is a member and associate of it, and C, that he participated in the activities of the gang through the commission of this offense that we've already proven, we can't bring in that other evidence. So we've got a higher threshold of proof, which allows us to bring in a higher quantum of evidence.
Thank you very much. And the second question to anyone in the panel that would like to answer, how it is, if at all, in your experience, that Mexican cartels relate to the gangs themselves through locally operating cells? My question is, do the Mexican cartels have their own cells who then in turn relate to the street gangs to distribute the drugs, or how does that work?
Quite frankly, our experience has been that there is, at least at the levels that we prosecute and investigate, that there is very little direct connection between the cartels and between the street level gangs here. What typically happens is the cells will distribute think about Costco. Think about an organization like that is, or a big wholesaler. So they will retail out in fairly large amounts. A cartel may send 100 kilos to Atlanta. Well, there'll be 5 20-kilo customers. Those typically aren't going to be the street gangs. Now that is ultimately at some point going to wind down through the distribution system and ultimately make it to those people that Mr. Carlson prosecutes, but there is very little connectivity. We don't see 18th-streeters talking to cell heads here in Atlanta, or 18th-streeters talking to the Mexican organizations back in Mexico. It ultimately, just like, again, you have your big warehouse, and it's going to go to a distributor who's going to send it to another lower level distributor and ultimately make its way to the street, but we find very little direct connection.
Any other questions? Great.
Thank you. Well, one of the great concerns about the application of the new criminal justice system in Mexico is especially many people think that they will not function to prosecute organized crime or violent crimes because of the risk of the witnesses going to an open court. Many have proposed, even now the federal government has a proposal to alter the rule of evidence to the witnesses, and in some cases when there is fear that the witness could be killed, you can introduce the interview, the written interview, and read it in court. The prosecutor can do that instead that the witnesses go there. The question about this item is, what can you propose to Mexico to say, how can you work with witnesses in these cases, no, and to protect them? And if your law, RICO, or the gang has made alterations about the witnesses, the rule of evidence about the witnesses, maybe hearsay or something. And the other question is, there's a very, very high impunity about homicides related to organized crime. I don't know, maybe 98% of executions in Mexico will not be resolved. And I have maybe one hypothesis, but I want you to confirm with all your experience about, prosecuting and investigating gangs and organized crimes. The problem is that the homicides, it's the local authorities who had to investigate and prosecute them, even though they may be related with organized crime. And the organized crime investigation, it's federal, as you may know. Don't you think that affects that the local authority who can't know and doesn't have the information about a cartel, for example, or a gang, will have to investigate this homicide, and another authority, they didn't communicate a lot, will have to investigate the gang or the cartel or the organized crime? Do you think that maybe what is one of the reasons that we are not at all effective in investigating and prosecuting executions related to organized crime?
Which one of you wants to take it?
I can take the first part of the question, sir. Under the federal rules of evidence, there is an exception to the hearsay rule, and thus an exception to the right of confrontation. It's called forfeiture by wrongdoing, okay? And what that means essentially is that if a defendant in a criminal case does something affirmative to prevent a witness from testifying against him or her, then that witness's statement can come in without the right of confrontation attaching. Because again, someone has forfeited by their wrongdoing their right to have confrontation. Now, recently, our Supreme Court has put some restrictions on that doctrine, and I won't get into all the nuances there, but look in the 800 series of the Federal Rules of Evidence for the rule called forfeiture by wrongdoing, and I think that'll answer a lot of the questions you have there.
Anybody else have comments? Scott, Mike?
We deal with cooperating witnesses a lot who have the fears that you're discussing of the folks in Mexico. Either they fear for their own safety here, or more often they fear for the safety of their family back in Mexico, because basically the drug organizations use folks whose families they know back in Mexico, so they can use that as leverage against the cooperators. As a general proposition, there's not a lot the federal system can do for a cooperator prior to an actual threat being leveled, at which time, of course, the authorities would take steps to at least try to protect the safety of the cooperator that's here. So instead, I think cooperators simply make a decision here, usually just looking at their own self-interest. Is it makes sense for me in terms of the sentence I'm looking at to cooperate or not? Will I receive a sufficient incentive that it makes sense for me to testify and cooperate even though harm may possibly come to me? And what I think is very helpful in that regard is that we have very certain, it's getting less so, but sentencing, which we have sentencing guidelines, so that a lawyer can sit down with a client and say to him, look, you're looking at exactly between 27 and 30 years. If you cooperate, you're now looking at between 15 and 20 years. And it's that certainty, I think, that allows the cooperator at least to make a decision, factoring in all the other things, including what you're talking about. But there's really no way to eliminate the threat against the cooperator and his family back in Mexico unless and until such time as a threat's actually been made. And at that time, then the authorities can intervene.
Any other questions? Well, any comments from the panel? Final comments from the panel?
I think there was a second part to your question about the effectiveness. Just really quickly, as I understood your question, your scenario was two different law enforcement entities, one investigating perhaps the murder and then the other. Let me tell you what we do here in the United States that we have truly, I think, found to be effective. First, on the federal level, I don't know that we see a scenario where if, let's say we're doing a drug investigation, there's a murder, that those agents who are involved in that drug investigation can't also investigate the murder. But to the extent that those are issues, we operate on a task force system a lot of times. What that means is a lot of deputy chiefs, officers who are local officers may work with the DEA agents that I work with, and they will work collaboratively together on a particular issue, a particular investigation. To the extent that there is a crime, perhaps a murder, perhaps, I don't know, other things that might be more properly suited to the Atlanta Police Department's area of expertise, we have the ability with those task force to carve out that particular piece of the investigation. So while still working together, we share that evidence, and they're able to take that piece of the investigation and investigate it and perhaps take it to the local DA's office if that's where it needs to go. Perhaps it might even be another prosecutor within my office in perhaps the violent crime section. It may go there. So we work, we try to bring together where it's appropriate multiple law enforcement entities. So that may include the DEA, that may include elements of the FBI, Secret Service, again, state and locals, and I think that effectively deals with I think what you raised as the concern.
Mike, Scott, Chief Moss, any final thoughts?
If I may, I'd just like to commend everybody for taking time from your busy schedule to participate in the program. As I began my comments, and I've heard echo by my learned colleagues, partnerships is the ultimate solution, I believe. So thank you all for taking the time. It's been an honor, and I'm humbled to be here. Thank you.
Let me interject. I think Professor Zweer has one.
I just wanted to know whether there were any creative, kind of outside the box things people are trying in your groups. It does seem to me what we've heard is there's not much of a connection between the gangs and the heads of the cartels. And I'm picking up a little bit of, in your voice, a little despair. That the resources are going down, and there seems to be an endless stream of gang members that fill the places of the folks that you are able to convict once you convict them. Or it just gets redistributed outside of jurisdiction, or it gets moved around. And I guess I'm getting a little, we've gotten this challenge earlier from earlier presentations of a bit of despair. And I wonder, are you feeling that? And is there anything that's being tried outside the box? For example, you hear about strategies of co-opting gangs themselves into being positive forces for the community. For example, are there strategies that you're looking at to try to get the very, very top people that at all have to do with or think about how it can also affect what happens on the ground, so that in fact the redistribution doesn't just get taken up by some other group in some way? And so I'm asking, is there anything new that is being done out there?
I don't think that what you're asking that they're new concepts. First, our investigations always are focused on the top of the organization. Always, that's always where we're going. But more to your point is that we do, particularly within the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I think that I don't want to speak too much for the department, but I think each administration does focus on efforts to reach out to the community to change that customer base. Obviously, if you can reduce that demand, well, you know, there's nobody who's going to want that product. I don't know. I mean, obviously, it has not been as successful as we would like, but we certainly, as a department, make those efforts. We certainly, within my office, make those efforts. We certainly reach out to the communities to change, to try to change the lives of those individuals who would distribute that end product. Obviously, if I can stop a 14-year-old from wanting to being attracted to that lifestyle, I don't have to address those issues in 10 years when he turns 24 or 25 and has become a significant street-level distributor. So to the extent that I don't want to say those are new and creative, because I think we have done that and we've been very good at that. When that doesn't work, I think that you see our more public face of, quite frankly, sending people to prison. I'm sure that the Dekalb does something similar. I'm sure that Ms. Keys and her next person will.
Well, first of all, both Ms. Keys Fleming and now Ms. Hicks White, our new district attorney, our new acting district attorney, I think, to have it. You know, I have been part of a lot of efforts, and some of them came from the National District Attorneys Association in terms of criminal street gangs, of having coordinated public efforts among various community partners to involve folks at various levels in dealing with the problems of these very dangerous organizations and the violence and other pain on society that they create. But one thing, Professor Swear, I want to be very careful about, we're very confident in Georgia, because it was not until 2006 we had a functional gang statute. And that was updated and upgraded in this legislative session due to the experience in using it over the preceding 4 years. And we believe that if other states and perhaps even the federal government adopt similar statutes, there's potential there to have the same effect on criminal street gangs that RICO did on Cosa Nostra. And of course, the federal authorities do a great job on their gang prosecutions under RICO. We only think can believe that would be enhanced the way the ones in Georgia were with the passage of that kind of statute. So we're very helpful. And one thing in terms of, yeah,
I just would say,
sure.
have you seen any reduction then in the number of gang members?
Absolutely, and you saw the crime statistics there, and they're stark in terms of the reductions we've seen in Dekalb County. And again, that's a test case of a county of about 1 million people that just has, does not have a 15-member gang prosecution unit. I'll put it that way. You're looking at the prosecutor from the gang prosecution unit. And just with one other thing, in terms of thinking outside the box, legislatively, procedural changes in law are usually the best way to deal with crime in terms of public safety. All too often, what we have seen in Georgia over the years was, if there was going to be a way to deal with the crime out there, just make a penalty longer, more prison time, criminalize some other sort of activity, and that never worked. But alterations in the rules of evidence and procedure, in other words, to guarantee that certain types of evidence under circumstances, the right ones procedurally and substantively, get to the jury, always make a bigger difference. So if I could say something about thinking outside the box, the better way to do that. I mean, again, at the state level in Georgia, changes were made in the rules of evidence and in accord with gangs, and we've seen a difference not only here, but in other counties in terms of lower numbers of crime, lower numbers of gang membership, lower numbers of gang growth. So again, thinking outside the box would be make the changes procedural, rules of evidence, rather than substantive.
Bill, Scott, and Mike, I want to thank you, and I want to give Chief Moss the last word.
Thank you. If I could just very quickly respond to a couple of thoughts. I don't know that I would characterize this as outside the box, but I think there are a couple of promising initiatives. One that we refer to as the Drug Market Initiative, and another more on the gang front that focuses specifically on gun violence and gun violent crime. The High Point Initiative, Cincinnati presently has undertaken an initiative similar to that, but the gist of it is simply balancing and blending prevention, treatment, and enforcement. And I just came back from Cincinnati where I sat on one of their call-ins where they brought in several of the high-profile known gang members who have made themselves very visible to law enforcement by their actions. And the gist of it is simply pulling together all the various stakeholders and offering those folks who aren't entirely embedded in the life already the opportunity to get out with job training, job opportunities, educational opportunities, and it has shown some promise elsewhere where it's been employed.
Well, thank you very much. I gather we're going to start up at 4:05? 4:10.
Thank you all.